I'll tell you what's a high tariff nation is Canada. Canada charges us 250% for our milk product and other product, and a tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such. And yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
Major American construction firms have issued a rare, coordinated warning. The housing market is entering a period of instability, driven by tightening Canadian softwood lumber supply, with no relief visible for the rest of the year. Here's what makes this warning different from every previous trade dispute headline. Canada has not announced an export ban. There has been no dramatic policy declaration, no shutdown notice, and yet American builders, developers, and contractors are scrambling because the impact on construction costs is already severe and accelerating towards something far worse. The part Washington has not fully acknowledged is structural rather than political. Roughly 30 to 35% of all softwood lumber used in American home building comes from Canada. Canada has fundamentally restructured how it prices, processes, and distributes that lumber in ways that sidestep traditional tariff frameworks entirely, while producing the same economic pressure on American buyers that a formal export restriction would create. No single action triggers a legal challenge. No single policy violates a trade agreement. The pressure comes from 5 structural shifts operating simultaneously, each one legal, each one defensible as domestic policy, and each one tightening the supply available to American construction at the same time. In a typical American wood frame house, lumber accounts for 20 to 25% of total material costs. A 10% increase in lumber prices adds between $8,000 and $15,000 to the price of a new home. For buyers already navigating elevated interest rates and persistent inflation, that increase is not a minor inconvenience. It is a structural shock that pushes home ownership permanently out of reach for a measurable share of American families. The question worth asking is not whether Canada banned lumber exports, it did not, but why Washington is increasingly alarmed about what may be the largest construction cost crisis in decades, despite no formal restriction having been announced. The first structural pressure point is production control. Canada has quietly reduced softwood lumber output by closing or consolidating older, less efficient sawmills across the country. Since the peak production year of 2018, national softwood production has fallen by roughly 15 to 20%. In British Columbia alone, more than 10,000 forestry jobs disappeared between 2019 and 2025. This is not a temporary market cycle. It is a deliberate reset of capacity designed to permanently reduce the volume of cheap lumber flowing into American markets. Fewer mills produce less output. Less output means tighter supply. Tighter supply means higher prices, and Canada captures that price premium rather than American buyers receiving the discount the old arrangement provided. The second pressure point is domestic priority. Canadian provinces are increasingly directing available lumber supply toward domestic housing projects, infrastructure development, and public construction initiatives. Exporting to the United States is no longer treated as the automatic default option. When supply tightens, American buyers move to the back of the allocation line, not because of an explicit tariff or regulatory barrier, but because of deliberate policy choice. Canadian provincial governments have decided their own citizens, builders, and economic development priorities come first. That shift in default priority changes the entire structural assumption underlying decades of North American lumber supply chains. The third pressure point is value-added processing. Canada is exporting dramatically less raw lumber and significantly more engineered wood products, cross-laminated timber, glued laminated beams, and advanced structural panels. The result is higher export revenue per shipment, but lower physical volume available for conventional American framing construction. Fewer affordable boards are available at any price point, because Canada now captures more revenue per tree by processing domestically rather than shipping raw logs south, keeping the jobs, wages, and economic value generated by that processing inside Canada, while American builders compete for a shrinking pool of basic framing lumber. The fourth pressure point is environmental standards. New carbon tracking requirements and sustainability certification frameworks raise compliance costs across the Canadian lumber industry. American buyers can still technically purchase Canadian lumber, but the product is now more expensive and less abundant than it was before these standards took effect. Environmental policy functions as an indirect trade lever, one that operates entirely outside traditional tariff frameworks while producing the identical economic outcome of reducing American access to low-cost lumber inputs. The fifth pressure point is logistics prioritization. Canadian railways and ports now prioritize energy shipments, mineral exports, and critical materials ahead of lumber in their scheduling and capacity allocation. Lumber shipments face deliberate sequencing delays, heightened transport cost uncertainty, and rising logistics expenses, an invisible squeeze that compounds every other pressure point already operating on the supply chain. None of these 5 elements individually constitutes a formal trade barrier. Together, they form a structural choke point that is extraordinarily difficult for the United States to counteract through conventional trade policy tools because there is no single violation to challenge and no single restriction to negotiate away. The downstream impact on American construction moves through compounding stages once lumber costs rise and supply tightens. The first stage is direct cost inflation. Builders do not simply absorb material price increases, they add risk premiums on top of those increases to protect against further volatility, which pushes new home prices higher faster than wage growth and deepens the existing housing affordability crisis while feeding inflation throughout the broader economy. This is precisely the mechanism through which a resource supply issue transforms into a political crisis capable of affecting election outcomes. The second stage is construction timeline disruption. Less predictable lumber supply creates scheduling chaos, with projects facing constant delays driven by material availability uncertainty. A single month of construction delay can raise total project costs by 5 to 7% through financing charges, labor retention expenses, and equipment rental fees. In a market already strained by trade tensions, these delays magnify financial losses rather than stabilizing the situation as supply eventually catches up. The third stage is market psychology turning destructive. Developers, distributors, and wholesalers rush to secure supply ahead of anticipated further tightening, creating hoarding behavior, speculative buying, and artificial shortages layered on top of genuine supply constraints. Prices climb not only because lumber is becoming objectively tighter, but because every market participant expects further tightening and behaves accordingly, a self-reinforcing feedback loop that destabilizes pricing across the entire construction economy, independent of actual physical supply conditions. The fourth and most politically dangerous stage is the housing affordability crisis, becoming an electoral issue. Rising home prices push younger American families permanently out of ownership, raise rents across major cities, and increase housing's weight inside consumer inflation calculations. As inflation stays elevated because of that housing cost pressure, interest rates remain higher for longer, creating an additional indirect cost spiral that traces directly back to a structural trade and resource dependency that decades of policy assumptions never seriously examined. What most American analysis of this situation misses entirely is that Canada gains structurally from the restructuring described above. By shifting away from raw lumber exports toward processed wood products, Canada captures more value per harvested tree while creating higher skilled, better paid domestic employment. Rather than exporting low margin raw material inputs to American builders, Canada now sells finished and semi-finished products, commanding stronger pricing power in global markets, a direct upgrade in Canada's economic positioning relative to the old arrangement. By embedding carbon tracking, sustainability certification, and full traceability requirements into its export framework, Canada positions itself as a rule setter in global lumber markets rather than a price taker subject to whatever rate American buyers were historically willing to pay. Canada is also protecting its long-term resource base by treating forests as strategic assets to be managed for decades of predictable yield rather than inventory to be cleared at maximum near-term throughput. Slower, more controlled harvesting supports ecological stability and long-term supply predictability, strengthening Canada's credibility as a reliable supplier to European and Asian buyers who are willing to meet Canadian sustainability standards and pay Canadian prices for that reliability, even as American buyers face escalating costs and tightening availability from the same supply base. Washington's available policy responses follow 3 paths. and all three carry significant structural limitations. Reimposing or escalating tariffs on Canadian lumber raises prices for American buyers without creating a single additional board foot of new supply. Expanding domestic American lumber production sounds viable on paper until environmental permitting timelines, legal challenges, and local community opposition make meaningful new capacity additions a multi-year undertaking rather than a near-term fix.